The fight for Hill 112 was to continue for some weeks, and the following varied accounts from the veterans will give some idea what the fighting there was like. Among the young tank troopers taking part was Bill Thompson of the 9th Battalion, the Royal Tank Regiment, 9 RTR. We had about a year of training before we embarked for Normandy, landing in tempestuous weather between the 19th and 22nd June as part of the 31st Tank Brigade in 8th Corps. This corps was made up predominantly of peacetime weekend soldiers, the TA or territorials and conscripts, green troops in the main, and we arrived in time to participate in Operation Ep.6, which aimed to punch a 2-mile gap in the German lines across the Orne and Odon. It was not an easy job, and the Germans brought in no less than 6 panzer divisions in the end to hold us back. My baptism of fire came on June 26th at Chaux, when our squadron of 18 Cromwell tanks moved into the village. The countryside was ideal for defence, made up of sunken roads and thick hedges. It was not only the Yanks who had the bocage to cope with. Snipers would pick off the tank commanders who had to keep their heads and shoulders out of their turrets to see what was going on, and in the lanes there was no way to turn left or right, and it was almost certain that a German tank, a Panther or Tiger, would be somewhere ahead, or a Panzerfaust. That first day my squadron lost 13 tanks out of 18. Fortunately, a number of the tanks were recoverable, and the loss among the crews was not too great, but the first one killed in my regiment was Sidney Chapman, our troop corporal. I remember thinking that he was married with 2 kids, and it seemed sad that a husband and father had to be killed in battle. At least we younger ones, I was 20, had no dependents. In that first action, C Squadron supported the 1st Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders of the 15th Scottish, and being half Scots, I was proud to be fighting alongside them. They took a lot of casualties, and that night I remember quite clearly the sound of the bagpipes as the Gordons and the other Scots battalions played laments, flowers of the forest, to honour their fallen. It made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Then came Malto and Hill 112, but around Caen that summer it was attack and counter-attack all the time. There was not a lot of love lost between us and the Americans at this time. The Americans thought that the British and Canadians were not moving fast enough, but we had around 7 panzer divisions on our front most of the time, and they only had 1, and that makes a difference, believe me. Ernie Cox of the 141st Regiment, RAC, has another account of this time. Hill 112 was not very high, but it was the key to this part of Normandy, as from its summit every move in the surrounding country could be observed. I belonged to a flame-throwing unit of Churchill tanks, and it was our job to take out the strong points with flame. Farmhouses would be turned into strong points by the Germans, and with the enemy well dug in, just shelling would not move them. The mortaring and shelling never stopped, and several men were wounded in the open when they did not get to cover quick enough. There were also Tigers moving about, and the first time I saw one my heart missed a beat. It was not 50 feet away, but on a second glance I saw the crew were hanging out the hatches where they had been shot. A 17-pounder anti-tank gun hidden in the hedges had done for it, but there was German infantry in the hedges, so we went along, flaming the hedgerows. When our infantry had been over the ground, one of their majors came over and asked if we wanted to inspect our handiwork. We declined. Peter Shepherd was on Epsom with the 25th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. We had been tasked to take part in the opening barrage on Chaux. The battle began at 7:30 a.m., but the infantry made slow progress mainly because of the deep minefield at Le Mesnil-Patry. Our guns were also held up by several traffic jams at the entrance to the minefield, and A Troop were hit by rifle fire on reaching the far side, forcing us to dismount and seek cover until the enemy had been cleared from the woods to our front. 2 small patrols were formed from the battery personnel and entered the wood. They had hardly gone in before heavy machine gun and rifle fire was opened, and no more was heard of them. Of the men who entered the wood, only one man, Gunner Erskine, returned. Help was sought from a platoon of infantry, who also entered the wood and came under heavy fire, and we eventually obtained help from some Shermans and honey tanks, which gave the wood a good plastering before another party of gunners went in, returning with 43 German prisoners, including a wounded officer. The other batteries of the regiment had also been in close contact with the enemy, and mopping up our position was not completed until the evening. There is little doubt that, like the 49th Division of 30th Corps, the 8th Corps formations, 15th Scottish and the tank brigades, pushed home their attacks on June 26th with considerable persistence and courage. The casualty figures are a bleak confirmation of that fact, with 2,720 men lost killed, wounded or missing in the 15th Scottish Division for that day alone. The British attacks were delivered in a textbook fashion. The infantry attacks pressed home with grenades and at the point of the bayonet. But it is fair to say that the Allied forces in Normandy, British, Canadian and American, had yet to get a grip on the Germans and were not getting ahead as quickly as they might have done. Tom Stokes of the 15th Scottish Division gives some reasons why. 227th Brigade of 15th Scottish had been moving forward, hoping that by the evening of June 26th, the two bridges over the Odon would be secured, but the villages of Chaux and other villages were heaps of ruins. Roads were blocked with rubble or so narrow that tanks could not get through. Off the road, after pouring rain, the fields were well nigh impassable to cross with trucks, carriers or tanks. 10th HLI, Highland Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Young, pushed forward, but soon ran into dug-in German tanks which had to be knocked out by anti-tank guns, and they were then pinned down by intense mortar fire. At Tourmeville, a German tank was shooting up our tanks as they turned into the main street. At Grainville, the Cameronians got in and consolidated despite accurate mortar and shell fire, as well as counterattacks by SS, so their casualties were heavy. Despite gains on the flanks, this salient, the Scottish corridor, south of Chaux, was only about 1.5 miles wide, and the enemy were gathering around the flanks. On a man-to-man basis, the German soldiers, especially in the well-equipped and fanatical SS units around Caen, were simply better soldiers, or at least better trained soldiers, than the Allied troops at this time. The fact that they fought so well when completely without air cover is just one indication of this fact. As time went on, all that would change. Soldiers learn fast in battle, or they die, and it is noticeable from the many accounts of American, British and Canadian veterans that although they are willing to acknowledge the skill and ingenuity of the German soldier, they were also quite willing to attack and take the battle to the enemy. On Epsom, the British attacks were fiercely resisted by the Germans. So were German counterattacks against the British infantry, soldiers who are famously stubborn in defence and very reluctant to give up ground they have taken or been ordered to defend. The Germans also had much better kit than their opponents, an abundance of automatic weapons, notably heavy machine guns deployed down to squad or section level, where their greater firepower overwhelmed the platoon weapons of the British. The German infantry anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust, the tank fist, was lethal in the close country of the Bocage and German mortars. Both 81mm and multi-barrelled Nebelwerfer were a real scourge, and German snipers ranging along the front took a heavy toll of Allied officers who quickly learned not to wave their arms about, display maps or carry revolvers. Ernie Cox tells of meeting a Panther tank. I was a driver-operator in a squadron, 141 RAC, the Buffs, in crocodile flamethrowers, but we were used as gun tanks to start with until the infantry realised we were useful. Hill 112 seemed to dominate the battlefront, and we seemed to be attacking it every few days. The Odon country was well suited to defence, and we took up a position on a ridge overlooking the river valley, and for once we could see for about 2,000 yards, and that is how we saw 5 panthers and 2 tigers. We were told to hold our fire until they got closer, no use engaging them otherwise, and they had not seen us. We had 2 troops and a command tank, 7 tanks in all, and I had an AP round up the spout. When the range came down to 800 yards, the command came to open fire, and our gunner lined up and fired at the nearest panther. It was a good shot on the front plate, and I expected it to burst into flames, as our tanks did, but it just kept on coming, so we quickly fired the next shot, only to see it bounce off the panther armour. At that point I stopped looking and concentrated on pushing more rounds into the breach, at least until I got to number 6, which stuck there, and I could not get it out. After some shoving and pushing, the shell case came out, but not the shell, and the floor of the tank was covered in cordite. Nasty stuff at the best of times, and as I looked out of the periscope, the Panther seemed awfully close and had not yet fired a shot. All we could do was watch it come on, unstoppable. Then, suddenly, it burst into flames as a Sherman Firefly on our flank opened up with its 17-pounder. No one got out, and then another Panther went up and they began to turn away. One of our tanks hit a Tiger right in the drive sprocket and stopped it. The crew took to the ditches and got away, and then another Panther went up in flames. If only we had had the 17-pounder instead of these useless 75mm, but for the Sherman Fireflies they would have rolled right over us. Later on, a recovery tank came out and dragged the damaged Tiger into our lines, and we had a look at it. That 88mm gun made ours seem like pop guns, and the score marks showed how many times it had been hit, but none of our shells had penetrated it. By the end, our casualties were over 100%, and by the war's end we were on our fourth tank. The Allied troops would learn how to cope with these German advantages, but they were taking heavy punishment in the meantime. All these factors were to play a part in the Epsom offensive, but on the evening of June 26th, the German intelligence officers at Army Group B were correct in their claim that the defenders had obtained a clear defensive success along the Odon River. On the other hand, the same report admits that this success had cost the ISS Panzer Corps its last reserves, with the forces of 12th SS and Panzer Lehr taxed to their utmost. In anticipation that the British attack would continue, a counterattack was planned, involving the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, plus a tank battalion of the 2nd Panzer and the 8th Werfer Brigade, a plan encouraged by the foggy weather which spared the German units from Allied air attack. Their attack should have gone in on June 27th, but the assembly of forces had been delayed by the destruction of the French rail network by the RAF and the French Maquis, so 8th Corps had time to come on again, moving forward at 5 a.m. on June 27th through another thick ground mist. Overnight, the 43rd Infantry Division of 8th Corps had taken over the ground won by the 15th Scottish, freeing that division to push on again at first light. By mid-morning, the 15th Scottish had reached the River Odon, found an undamaged bridge at Tourmeville and crossed over. This division was now spearheading the advance, while 49th Division of 30th Corps had secured the right flank of the advance by taking Texel-Bretteville, northwest of Rauray. 11th Armoured provided close support to the advancing Scots, and 43rd Division deployed to hold the left flank against probes from tanks and infantry from ISS Panzer Corps. As 15th Scottish pushed across the Odon, the effect was to create a salient reaching south across the Odon, its point resting on Hill 112. Hill 112 is not much of a hill. It is best imagined as a rise in the ground, rather like a long ridge between the Odon and the Orne, barely noticeable from the east or west, but a distinct obstacle to any forces coming up from the steep-sided Odon Valley onto the open plateau. The fighting for Hill 112 marked all the forces engaged there and features strongly in the veterans' accounts, as Ernie Cox of the 31st Armoured Brigade confirms. Hill 112 was an awful place. Dotted with small hamlets that were just piles of rubble, the debris of war blew across the battlefield, letters from home, photos of loved ones, all that is left of a casualty, each one a story. Wrecked and burnt-out tanks did the crews get out on time? Few did. Ammo boxes, rifles, blankets, equipment of all kinds, the putrid stink of death and the carcasses of dead farm animals. There were times when we drove over them in the dark, and then the vile-smelling mess would revolve around in the tracks, while inside we would be trying not to vomit. One thing we knew, the enemy tanks were better than ours, and virtually all the panzer divisions faced us and could see us from the top of Hill 112. They shelled us, they mortared us, and we sat there, hanging on and taking casualties. Pyrotechnics of burning lorries, exploding trucks of ammunition, and still we stayed there. Once through the woods on the south side of the Odon, their advance followed closely by 11th Armoured's tanks, 15th Scottish gained the north slopes of Hill 112, east of the village of Esquay, and there they held and were held. Time and again the British infantry surged up to the open crest of 112, but the Germans held that crest and the reverse slope and declined to give them up. They also held both flanks of the narrow salient the British thrust had established from the river towards Hill 112, and now had this salient under fire from three sides. Hill 112 is the ideal spot from which to view the battlefield west of Caen. To the north lie the runways and hangars of Carpiquet airfield, which was still in German hands. So was Caen to the northeast. To the north lie the woods along the Odon Valley and the higher ground beyond. Much of this too was still in German hands. To the south, flat, open and west of the Orne, lies the object of this Epsom attack, the start of the Confalaise plain. Finally, just to the southwest, stands the town of Villers-Bocage and another local summit, Montpinçon. It takes no military experience or expertise whatsoever to realise the value of Hill 112. Jack Woods, a trooper in 9 RTR, fought at Hill 112 on Epsom. We sailed for Normandy during the storm, and I was as sick as a dog. All I wanted to do was die, as the LST we were on did everything but sink. The day after we landed, we were told off to support the 15th Scottish at Shoe on Epsom, which did not mean much to me at the time. Then I was told to report to the recce officer as his driver had injured his hand in the top hatch. His replacement was me, and so I went into battle for the first time in my life. It was a lousy day, pouring with rain, and just to cheer us up we passed some 7 RTR Churchills being taken back with ominous holes in their hulls and turrets. We then spent the rest of the day stuck in traffic jams, finally getting up to the tanks late in the day and witnessing a scene which has stayed with me for the rest of my life. Some of our tanks, which we had been told in the UK were impenetrable, were blazing away merrily on the skyline, giving out clouds of black smoke or a firework display of exploding ammunition. Those of the crews who survived were coming back, their faces registering the shock of what had happened to them. The infantry, not having reached their objectives, were also coming back, those that were left anyway and regrouping by the road. We stayed there a while, and there I saw my first dead Germans, a group led by a sergeant and freshly killed. The Jocks who had done the job were still crouching in the hedgerow. Further on we passed a burning half-track, its infantry component hanging dead over the side. Then we bellied the armoured car and had to be extracted by a Bren gun carrier, while a Spandau stitched a line of bullets up our back. It transpired afterwards that this road was the front line. How green we were, standing there while the recce officer went off to do his bit, and us waiting there with not a personal weapon in sight and the Bren gun stowed. Then German tanks were coming up, and we elected to abandon the car and bail out, making our way back across the fields. What I remember of the rest of the day was a Panzer Mark IV being knocked out by an infantry 6-pounder, and our radio operator crouching at the door of the armoured scout car, desperately trying to raise the squadron, "Hello, Sugar Niner, report my signals, over," and then the squadron coming over the horizon like a cavalry charge. So the day ended. On June 29th, the Germans made a determined attempt to take back the northern slope of Hill 112 and push the British back across the Odon. The British bridgehead south of the river was untenable unless it could be expanded, for it was surrounded on 3 sides by high ground from which fire could be poured down on the river crossings and on any troops attempting to reinforce the British foothold on the northern slope of Hill 112. The British were reluctant to give up this ground, and the fight for the hill at the end of June became one of the epic struggles of the Normandy battle. 2 SS Panzer divisions, 2 SS Das Reich, and 10 SS of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, backed by 9th SS Panzer, which had been holding the ground south of the Odon, were flung into this counterattack against the salient south of Shoe, deploying Tiger tanks and concentrating their efforts on the 29th Armoured Brigade around Hill 112. Their first attack was driven off, but enemy pressure only intensified, with heavy artillery concentrations and plenty of stonking from Nebelwerfer multiple-barrelled mortars. The rain cleared away on June 29th and 2nd TAF were active, with typhoons swooping down to attack German tanks with rockets and cannon fire. Still, the German pressure on Hill 112 and the Odon salient continued as the 11th Armoured Division crossed the Odon and attempted to enlarge the 15th Scottish bridgehead south of the river. The pounding of Hill 112 by artillery, German and British, now reached great war proportions. Shellfire scoured the trees and grass from the slopes, infantry and tanks attacking and counter-attacking all round the bridgehead perimeter, where both sides were now feeding in more troops and tanks. On the British side, this included the first elements of the Guards Armoured Division, the 32nd Guards Brigade, which was put under command of the 43rd Division and positioned along the Cambayeux Road, west of Carpiquet. The village of Mouan, north of the Odon and to the left of the salient, had been taken on June 28th, but the woods between there and the river remained in German hands. Bad weather prevented much Allied air support reaching the Odon bridgehead, and the Luftwaffe appeared again, only to be taken on at once by the arrival of fighters from 83 Group, 2nd TAF, which shot down a number of enemy aircraft and then strafed targets on the ground. Heavy fighting continued all that day. German pressure was coming in all around the salient, especially on the top of Hill 112, though a major attack by newly arrived units of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 9th SS and 10th SS was disrupted by Allied airstrikes and artillery concentrations. However, it was clear to General O'Connor that the Germans were gathering their strength for a major counterattack by several SS Panzer divisions against the Odon salient. He therefore decided to break off any attempt at a further advance, pull back from the northern slope of Hill 112 to a narrow bridgehead east of the Odon and dig in to resist what was coming. The anticipated German attack did not come in on June 30th, mainly because naval gunfire and artillery concentrations fell on the German forming up positions. But early on the morning of July 1st, the Germans attacked the southern end of the Odon bridgehead at Gavras with infantry, and thrust infantry and tanks into the right flank of the salient at Grainville. Both attacks were halted by artillery concentrations and airstrikes, without which the British infantry would have been in considerable trouble. German attacks were resumed later and continued throughout the day, and were only broken off after the Germans had lost between 30 and 40 tanks. British infantry, aided by crocodile flame-throwing tanks, then hunted down pockets of enemy infantry within the salient and had restored their lines by nightfall. Once again, the advantage in the Normandy battle went to the defenders, in this case the British. The slender British salient across the Odon had been battered by this attack, but it still held. On the other hand, it was not expanding, and maintaining it was proving expensive. The British advance was now being held between the Orne and the Odon rivers, and more German divisions were coming up to seal off the salient. 9th SS Panzer had already been identified in the attacks on the right flank astride Grainville, and 10th SS Panzer had been involved in the attack on Gavras. The only apparent advantage accruing to the Allies by holding the Odon bridgehead was that to contain this British attack, these strong panzer divisions had been forced to expend effort and tanks, which might have been better employed in a strong counter-offensive against the Allied line elsewhere, or been sent west to aid the defenders of Saint-Lô. It can also be claimed that these two experienced SS Panzer divisions, 9th SS and 10th SS, expended their strength here to defend the Caen front, and were never used, as Hitler originally intended, in a strong attack to break the Allied line at Caumont. This being so, it can also be claimed that Montgomery's strategy, to contain and write down the German panzer divisions on the British front, was working well. As the panzers came up, so they were consumed. Even so, further progress with the Epsom offensive or across the Odon at this time was deemed to be impossible, other than at great cost. There were now 8 panzer divisions covering the Second Army front between Caumont and Caen, and some 200 tanks, plus a quantity of panzer grenadier infantry, were directly confronting the British 11th Armoured Division along the Odon. In view of this, says Montgomery, it was decided that 8th Corps should concentrate for the time being on holding the ground already won, and regrouping started with the object of withdrawing our armour into reserve ready for renewed thrusts. On the night of June 29th, therefore, The troops still clinging on the shell-torn slopes of Hill 112 were withdrawn. The Epsom offensive was over. It would be charitable to call it a draw, since the objectives of the attack were not achieved, and the losses, especially in 15th Scottish, were severe. But if the aims of Epsom are compared with the results, it is hard not to conclude that the Germans had the best of it. The Orne had not been crossed. The Caen-Falaise plain was still out of reach. Caen and Carpiquet were still in German hands, and Hill 112, drenched in blood, had been given up after days of heavy fighting. In the short term, the Germans had enjoyed the best of it locally, but there is also the strategic factor to consider. German losses, especially in tanks, were considerable. Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS had received another drubbing. 9 and 10 SS Panzer had been committed to a fight which not only cost them tanks, but also diverted them from the purpose for which they had been called from the Russian front, an attack on the junction of the Anglo-American line at Caumont. The Germans had been forced into another heavy commitment against the British, when they should have been redeploying to resist the Americans now moving on Saint-Lô, although in the event the German forces in the west proved quite sufficient to bring the US advance to a halt. Finally, the new, untried troops of the British 8th Corps had been flung in battle against the pick of the Wehrmacht and given a good account of themselves. It was now the end of June, more than 3 weeks into the Normandy battle. Apart from getting ashore and staying ashore and linking up the beachheads, the only concrete success had been the belated capture of Cherbourg. On the other hand, territorial objectives were not everything. The German army had been brought to battle in the west, and if the losses were not on the scale of those suffered by the German armies fighting on the Eastern Front, they were not inconsiderable as the casualty figures from D-Day to June 30th indicate: killed, wounded and missing. British and Canadian, 24,698. American, 37,034. Allied total, 61,732. German total, 80,783. These figures require some analysis. At this stage, the US total is inflated somewhat by the heavy losses taken by the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions at Omaha on D-Day, and by the losses in the 2 US airborne divisions. The German total is inflated by the large number of prisoners recently taken at Cherbourg, but the notable difference is the one between the British and Canadian casualty figure and the American one. The losses of D-Day may inflate the US total, but the difference, almost 1/3, is too wide to be bridged by the events of D-Day alone. While every army and corps was carrying out its allotted task, the Second Army had been engaged in a series of offensives against crack German formations, as the Epsom offensive illustrates, and the casualties taken by the 15th Scottish Division alone underlines, while the Americans had kept up a steady pressure in the Cotentin and on the west flank, but against far less well-equipped or well-trained formations. Why then the difference? Up to this stage in the battle, the British and Canadians had roughly the same number of men ashore as the Americans, and since both the Allied armies were attacking, it might appear reasonable that their casualty figures would be roughly the same. The first answer, one popular with a certain type of historian, was that the Second Army was not doing its fair share of the fighting, or that the British and Canadian troops were not pressing their attacks home, but sitting in safety, drinking excessive amounts of tea. American historians are particularly given to mentioning tea. As evidence, these historians point out that while there was some fighting every day on the Second Army front, Second Army was putting in a series of specific set-piece offensives Perch and Epsom, for example with intervals between each one, while the American divisions were attacking all out and all the time. This scenario is not entirely correct. As we have seen, the US 5th Corps had stopped before Saint-Lô, while on the 7th Corps front there were delays in sealing off the peninsula and in the advance up the Cotentin to Cherbourg. This is no criticism of either corps or the American soldiers. After attacks, all units need to reorganize, re-equip and reinforce, and the problems of supply and the Great Storm had obliged both armies to call off or delay attacks. Before attacking, units need time to plan and prepare, issue orders, rest their men, carry out reconnaissance, agree a fire plan, and bring up ample supplies of artillery ammunition to support the attack. The idea of continuous attacks all along the line, all the time, is rarely feasible in practice. It is true that some British formations, 7th Armoured and 51st Highland, seem to have lost their Western Desert verve at this time, but on the other hand, the US history lists formations the 90th Division, for example, that had also failed to deliver the required amount of get up and go. In both armies, generals were to be sacked for their perceived failures in command. In terms of performance, there is little to choose between the Allied armies, and chauvinistic comments by historians do little to illuminate the true position at the time, and yet we have this interesting difference in casualty figures. A careful study of the available information and discussions with the veterans would suggest that the reason for the difference in casualty figures lies not in any particular British unwillingness to fight, but because many US infantry formations were simply not well enough trained for the sort of fighting Normandy required, and therefore took heavy casualties in the bocage. This is particularly noticeable among the two Omaha divisions, the 1st Infantry and the 29th Infantry. They were well-trained formations which lost heavily on D-Day and had to be topped up with reinforcements. These new soldiers were not well trained and were not well assimilated by the D-Day veterans. By the end of June, casualties in these divisions topped 100% in some of the rifle companies, as they did in some of the British units. Take, for example, this account from A.L. Hayman, a 19-year-old infantryman in the 7th Battalion Somerset Light Infantry, 43rd Division. I was a corporal in 10 Platoon B Company. Hill 112, when we attacked it later, was like a second Verdun. We attacked at 4 a.m. and reached our objective at 8 p.m., covering about 1,500 yards that day, and by that time I was the senior rank in the company, which had just 23 men left. We were then counter-attacked and reduced to just 18 men, but we held the hill. I can tell you about the Caen area where we were constantly putting in attacks but not going far, and had to endure a lot of artillery and mortars. We lost 3 commanding officers in 2 weeks, 2 killed and 1 wounded. We needed replacements, and we got a lot of Royal Artillery men who had been on light anti-aircraft sites where they were not needed, so they were transferred to the infantry. They were not pleased, I can tell you. We did not like working with tanks as they drew shell fire, and we could not hear the sound of the shells coming with the engine noise, and tanks were anyway not much good in that close country. After Hill 112, my section of 10 men had just 3 in it, so I got 7 replacements. Our OC was Major Whitehead, a finer officer there never was. He always carried a rifle, and when he was wounded he would not leave until the hill was taken. Then he was wounded again, in the jeep taking him back down the hill, when it was hit by shell splinters, but he survived and came back to use later. I hope this gives you some idea of what it was like. Good training reduced casualties, and it is noticeable that within days of the landings, General Bradley was insisting on more training for his troops, and this for divisions that were actually in theatre at the time, and one would hope were already fully trained and ready for combat. This difference in battlefield capability is pointed up by the superb performance of the 2 US airborne divisions in the Cotentin. The 82nd and 101st good training and leadership seem to be the vital factors here, rather than combat experience, because the 82nd had been in action before, and the 101st had not. The US official history records. All during the rest of June, training took place in the 5th Corps zone to perfect tank infantry tactics, which could set the attack rolling once more towards St. Lo when the time came. Author's italics. This tends to confirm the view that the US units were not attacking all the time and were in need of more training. It has also to be remembered that the hedgerows of Normandy would be strange indeed to the young soldiers in units newly arrived from the USA, and therefore totally unused to enemy action of any kind, or even the wartime atmosphere of Britain. Such troops would be particularly open to casualties in the early days when everything was strange to them. Then there is the matter of basic US military philosophy. This dictates that it is better to fight all along the line, all the time, at whatever cost, rather than get involved in a prolonged campaign. That philosophy had been the basis of US military thinking since General Grant attacked Robert E. Lee in the Virginia wilderness during the US Civil War 80 years before the Normandy battle, and for the same reason. The side that has more troops can afford heavy casualties to get the job done and the war over. The name for this kind of strategy is attrition. A policy based on attrition can be very expensive in lives, especially if the enemy has troops of the caliber of the German formations now fighting in Normandy, on ground of their own choosing and ideal for defence. It is at least arguable, for example, that US losses at Omaha might have been fewer had the US assault plan included more DD tanks and the employment of the British-designed special armour, such as mine-clearing flails, flame-throwing tanks or petard, pillbox-busting tanks, to help get their embattled infantry off the beach. This equipment was offered but declined, largely on the technical ground that it was mounted on Cromwell tanks, which the US Army did not employ, but also because these defence-busting devices were regarded by Bradley as an unnecessary frill. The British, with far fewer troops, simply could not afford to expend them in such a fashion, and doing so is anyway not part of British military thinking. The possible losses in an attack are always factored in, and the maximum available support in guns and aircraft is, as at Epsom, always provided to minimise infantry losses. Letting an offensive degenerate into a battle of attrition is simply not the way the British do it. That is one lesson the British generals learned from the million casualties of Passchendaele and the Somme during the Great War, a war in which many of the British generals, including Montgomery, had served in the front line. It is also fair to repeat that the Allied casualties in Normandy would have been fewer and Allied progress quicker had it not been for the skill, courage and tenacity of the Germans. It is not fair to hint or allege, as some historians have done, that the smaller British casualties indicate a lack of a British will to fight. As we shall see, by the time the battle ended, in percentage terms on the basis of troops committed, the casualty figures, British and American, were almost exactly the same, around 10%. The Allied troops in Normandy, serving in frontline formations, American or British, Canadian or Polish, did not flag or fail, nor did they look too far into the future. When the Normandy battle ended, hardly mattered. It would end in an Allied victory, but the true cost would be paid by them in the valleys and the bocage. Von Rundstedt and Rommel were certainly under no illusion about the eventual outcome of the Normandy campaign. Their chance to defeat the invasion had been lost on D-Day, and now it was only a matter of time before the Allied build-up led to a massive German defeat. However, Rommel and von Rundstedt also felt that this defeat could be delayed for some time if they were given a free hand to manoeuvre their troops, to fall back to more defensible positions, and make the Allies pay dearly for every metre of ground. This belief was one they shared with the other German generals in Normandy, including Geyer von Schweppenberg and the new commander of 7th Army, SS General Hausser. Hitler's insistence on holding every position and making fruitless counterattacks to regain any position lost was eating away at Army Group B's manpower, tanks and supplies, while the Allied build-up continued and would grow at a faster rate once Cherbourg was open for shipping. German discontent with Hitler, however, was more than matched by the Allied High Command's unhappiness with Montgomery. The issue at Schaeff was Caen. June had gone, and Epsom had been called off, and Caen was still untaken, and who could now deny that the battle for Normandy had become a stalemate? Well, General Montgomery could and did. On June 30th, as the Epsom offensive ended, he issued a new set of orders to Dempsey and Bradley, orders aimed at getting another phase of the campaign underway without delay. The Canadians were to take Carpiquet, which would shut up Air Chief Marshal Tedder, Conyngham and the RAF, while Bradley's First Army, which had bustled north to take Cherbourg, where the last elements of German resistance had been snuffed out on the previous day, was to turn about and capture St. Lo. The orders to Bradley on what happened then were the blueprint for the later Cobra operation, the St. Lo breakout, as the American soldiers call it, which would then follow. Tedder's campaign against Montgomery had been provided with fresh ammunition by the calling off of Epsom, and the Air Chief Marshal was again roaming the corridors of Schaeff, spreading alarm and despondency, and dripping more poison into Eisenhower's ears about the state of affairs at the front in Normandy. Nigel Hamilton's comment that Tedder's intrigue, as Deputy Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, must rank as one of the most reprehensible performances by a senior Allied commander in modern battle history seems entirely accurate. There seems to be a common thread in Tedder's attacks. On June 22nd, Tedder recounts how Conyngham was complaining to him about Montgomery's dilatory methods. On July 1st, again according to Tedder's memoirs, it was Eisenhower who told him that he was worried about Montgomery's dilatory methods. The question that now arises is, if everyone at Schaeff, Eisenhower, Tedder, Morgan, Conyngham, and apparently also Bedell Smith, Ike's intelligent and sensible chief of staff, were worried about Montgomery's dilatory methods, why did they not do something about it? Could it be perhaps they did not know what to do, or what alternatives to propose to what Montgomery was already doing? They could criticize, certainly, but as for cast-iron guaranteed ways to push the German army out of the way, they had no suggestions to make, except to propose more attacks against entrenched German opposition, attacks that might keep the Schaeff commanders happy, but led to no apparent strategic gain. Eisenhower was the Allied supreme commander. If he really was dissatisfied with Monty's performance, why did he not act? He had a dozen courses open to him, ranging from giving Montgomery a direct order to attack and go on attacking until something broke to taking personal charge of the land battle. If he was unwilling to get a grip on Monty himself, he could have asked Alan Brooke, the British CIGS, to do it for him. Monty was always careful not to disobey Brooke. If Ike felt there was no help there, for Brooke understood the strategy and agreed with what Montgomery was doing. He could have appealed to Churchill for another general or taken the entire matter to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington, where Marshall would certainly have backed him to the hilt. Eisenhower did none of these things. He simply listened to the whinges of Tedder and Conyngham and then started whinging himself. It should also be remembered that both the Allied armies were part of Montgomery's 21st Army Group and working to Monty's strategic plan at this time. It is therefore a little unfair to criticize Montgomery for the so-called stalemate at Caen and not give him due credit for the success of his plan in the Cotentin. First take Cherbourg, then turn on Saint-Lô. In spite of the ongoing claims of American historians, the Battle of Normandy was an Allied battle, not a purely American show. Monty's directive to Bradley and Dempsey on June 30th, which will be discussed further in the next chapter, is worth noting. It states clearly the position which Montgomery was to maintain about his overall strategy for the Normandy campaign: to pull the German armour on to the Caen-to-Caumont front in order to let the Americans break out in the west. Having done so, the Americans would then head south, send forces into Brittany to take the ports there, then head east to encircle the German forces west of the Seine. This was the plan that eventually succeeded, but it may not be the exact original Montgomery plan with which the Allies entered the battle. By declaring that it was Monty again, provided his critics with knives to plunge into his back. It was always the intention that the eventual breakout should be made by the Americans in the west. The later tale that Montgomery intended to break out at Caen, and that when he failed to do so, Bradley and Patton saved his bacon by breaking out at Saint-Lô, is simply not true. A breakout in the east had been part of the Cossack plan, which Eisenhower and Monty had rejected months before D-Day, but the notion that Monty intended to break out in the east at Caen-Falaise remains part of the popular myth which will take some time and a great deal of objectivity to remove. Another method is simply to refer again to the facts. The strategic plan of campaign for Normandy was laid out by Montgomery on April 7, 1944, and has been discussed before. Regarding events after the taking of Cherbourg, the plan reads as follows. In its subsequent operations, the Second Army will pivot on its left and offer a strong front against enemy movements towards the lodgement area from the east. In his account of the campaign planning, Montgomery states that the general strategic plan was to make the breakout on the western flank, pivoting the front on the Caen area, author's italics, where the bulk of the enemy reserves were to be engaged. This states that the Caen area will be the hinge for the Allied armies as they swing south, and the word area is interesting. We are not talking about the square in front of the Abbaye aux Hommes. That hinge might swing at Caen or somewhere further east, perhaps at the mouth of the Seine, or perhaps further west at Caumont or Vire, but on that hinge the entire Allied force was to pivot and turn east. That was the declared intention in April 1944, 2 months before the invasion, but the important point is and was that the breakout would come in the west. Now, 1 month into the invasion, Monty was coming up with a new or slightly revised plan based on the current situation, which certainly called for some revision. The immediate task of the British Second Army now, he stated, was to pin and fight the maximum enemy strength between Caen and Villers-Bocage, while the main American thrust swung south and then east to the Le Mans-Alençon area and beyond. US First Army was required to begin on the right flank with an offensive southwards on July 3rd, and then, pivoting on its left at Caumont, author's italics, to swing eastwards to the general line Caumont, Vire, Mortain, Fougères, that is northeast to southwest, from Normandy into Brittany. When the base of the Cotentin Peninsula was reached near Avranches, the right-hand US Corps, 8th Corps, should be turned westward into Brittany plans, must now be made for the rest of General Bradley's command to direct a strong right wing in a wide sweep south of the Bocage country, to successive objectives as follows: A. Laval-Mayenne, B. Le Mans, Alençon. The current situation was that the German panzer divisions were containing the Second Army at Caen, or being kept there by British pressure around the town. This created a situation where Second Army could not pivot at Caen, but could press hard against the enemy forces in the east, while the US armies in the west did the pivoting, perhaps at Saint-Lô, or as stated in Monty's June 30th directive from the junction of the Allied line at Caumont. And having pivoted, they then came east, south of the restrictive grip of the Bocage, on an axis of advance from Avranches through Mortain, Domfront, Argentan and Alençon, a strategy which, if speedily executed, would put the 7th Army in the bag as the British and Canadians came south. There is nothing wrong in any of this. It is more or less what actually happened 2 months later at the end of August, and mostly this plan worked. The problem came later, when Monty claimed that idea of pivoting at Caumont had been his intention all along. This claim is debatable on the basis of how big is the Caen area, but in the context of the campaign as a whole, it hardly matters. The Allied armies had to pivot somewhere, for their strategic objectives lay north and east, not south and west. To dismiss an entire strategy, and a successful one, because the pivot point has moved 23 miles to the southeast, from Caen to Caumont, is willful nitpicking. It is also highly desirable that generals should change their minds, and their plans, if the situation has changed and requires it. Why a change of mind should be seen as some kind of failure in a commanding general escapes this writer, but this too is a point to which we shall return. For the moment the future strategy was clear, and in spite of later claims made by his enemies, it was Montgomery's strategy and nobody else's. The Americans were to take Saint-Lô and push on south and west to clear Brittany and open the Breton and Loire ports, Brest, Lorient, Nantes and Saint-Nazaire. Second Army were to carry on with their constant attacks at Caen and Carpiquet, but must, above all, maintain maximum pressure on the German positions in the east to hold the enemy forces defending that flank in position. To this hard and thankless task Dempsey and his men, British and Canadian, now returned. Attrition or stalemate? June 30th to July 9th. The most consistent mistake made by the Allied commanders in northwest Europe was a failure to realise, despite repeated examples, the will and tenacity of the German army to resist against overwhelming odds and in the most appalling conditions. Carlo d'Este decision in Normandy. According to many people at Schaeff, by the end of June 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day, the Allied armies were getting nowhere in the battle for Normandy. Apart from the capture of Cherbourg, the Allied front line had hardly moved since the beaches had linked up on June 12th, and some of the senior officers, most of them British Tedder, Morgan, Conyngham, were becoming extremely impatient with General Montgomery and critical of his methods. Nor were they alone in this. In his memoirs, General Eisenhower comments, "Late June was a difficult time for all of us. More than one of our high-ranking visitors began to express the fear that we were stalemated, and those who had prophesied a gloomy fate for Overlord were being proved correct. This statement is somewhat at variance with the facts. The Allies had now been in Normandy for 24 days, having successfully carried out the largest amphibious operation in history. On June 29th, one of their armies had taken the vital port of Cherbourg, and another one was currently engaged on a major battle with 5 German panzer divisions astride the Odon. More troops were coming ashore, more airstrikes flown, more enemy soldiers were being killed and their tank forces destroyed. The German forces in Normandy were being written down, and according to the agreed strategic plan, the Seine crossing was not due to take place for another 2 months. When the battle is calculated to last 3 months, is there any reason to cry stalemate after just 3 weeks? Eisenhower's account goes on to point out that an invading force must not be penned up in its beachhead, that it needs room to bring in more troops and prepare for the breakout. 2 blinding glimpses of the obvious that provide little enlightenment on how this should be done, or reasons why it was not being done. Eisenhower's impatience with General Montgomery is revealed in something he does not say. I spent much time in France conferring with General Bradley and General Montgomery concerning the timing and strength of projected battle operations. Such visits with Bradley were always enjoyable. Perhaps Eisenhower's meetings with Monty were less enjoyable because General Montgomery did not tell Eisenhower what the Supreme Commander wanted to hear, that the armies were attacking all along the line, all the time a logistical impossibility but an encouraging prospect, or that Monty declined to make any comment on the current situation at all, other than that in his opinion it was going well. One of General Montgomery's less endearing characteristics was his complete faith in his own ability, a factor irritating to both his American colleagues and the powers that be at SHAEF. The problem was one of character or attitude. Montgomery was an extremely able and widely experienced general. He seemed to know what he was doing and where this campaign was leading, but a few explanations to his superiors would not have gone amiss, since they could not be expected to share his vision. Refusing to attend meetings, sending his chief of staff, Freddy de Guingand, to represent him when Eisenhower came to confer with his commanders, was not a good policy, although often taken as arrogance instead of what it really was, sheer bad manners. That said, it could be argued that Monty was acting in accordance with standard British Army practice. The senior commander always goes forward to see the situation. The junior commander does not come back to report on it. Here again, if Eisenhower did not like this practice, he should not have tolerated this. Monty was an officer who had to be gripped, and would respond to a firm hand. Alan Brooke, the British CIGS, told Eisenhower as much. If Eisenhower had gripped Monty, many problems might have been avoided, and Eisenhower might have gained a better understanding on the way the battle was going. Montgomery asked that his superiors take his views on trust, because he thought it obvious that he knew what he was doing. Perhaps he did, but they would still have welcomed some hints as to why he believed his plans were working out, or why, whatever the present state of play, all would turn out well in the end. Had he deigned to provide them with his views and explain his policies in person, a great deal of misunderstanding and bad feeling might have been avoided at the time and later. Unfortunately, this was not Monty's way, not with his subordinates, not with his colleagues, not with his senior commander. He had been placed in charge of the land campaign in Normandy. He intended to run it his way, and he expected everyone to back him up. There is merit in this point of view. A commander is appointed to do a job. He then has to be trusted to do it, given the necessary resources and supported every step of the way. If he fails or loses the trust of his superiors, he must be sacked. There is, of course, a middle way. When the original master plan, the strategy does not seem to be working or has to be changed, the superiors are entitled to an explanation. This Montgomery not only declined to provide at the time, he later claimed that the original plan had worked out in every detail, a claim which even the most objective observers find hard to accept. Montgomery seemed unable to appreciate that complete faith in his overall strategy was a lot to expect from his superiors, unless he shared his views with them, and gave sound reasons for his actions, and explained lack of results in territorial terms. This was especially necessary at this time, because Eisenhower had still not been able to establish his headquarters in France. Staying in Britain kept Eisenhower at one remove from the day-to-day action, hearing a constant drip of criticism at chafe from Tedder and Morgan, while coming under constant pressure from Marshall, the combined chiefs of staff, the politicians and the press in Britain and the USA, who were becoming increasingly critical over the lack of progress in Normandy. Less was heard about the shortage of airfields. There were now 12 airstrips in the British sector and another 11 in the American sector, including one above Omaha Beach, from which some 15,000 US casualties had already been evacuated in C-47 transport aircraft to hospitals in England. By July 5th, all of number. 83 Group, 2nd TAF, and 9 fighter groups of the US 9th Air Force were operating from French airfields, and over 6,000 RAF and USAAF aircrew had already been lost in the battle for Normandy. One of them was Flight Lieutenant Bill Junker of the Royal Canadian Air Force, whose story is another reminder that this battle was costing a quantity of lives. On the night of April 5th of July, they had dropped their bombs on a mission to Villeneuve-Saint-Georges and turned for home when they were hit by anti-aircraft fire. Another report says they were hit by a night fighter. An engine caught fire and the fire spread to the wing. Flight Lieutenant Junker then ordered the crew to bail out, which they all did, except the tail gunner, Pilot Officer Bill Gracie, whose legs had been injured and who was unable to extricate himself from the turret. It is reported that Junker, who was getting ready to bail out, heard of Gracie's predicament and decided to try and land the aircraft. He took it down to an open field, but the damage had spread, and both men were killed in the crash. Their bodies were taken by the local French people of Tronchet and buried in the churchyard where the graves were well tended. Monty's reticence over his intentions was both misguided and unnecessary. There were good reasons for the current hold-up, most of which have been spelled out in previous chapters. Another reason for delay at the end of June, and a perfectly valid one, was a need to regroup. The US 7th Corps, having mopped up German resistance in the Cap de Hogue around Cherbourg, needed to turn about and head south, pushing out of the Cotentin to open up a path to Avranches and the Brittany ports. Lacking these ports, some materials, like artillery ammunition, was still in short supply, and large amounts of ammunition were needed to support any attack against the sort of defences the Germans had established in the Bocage before St. Lo. The US history states that the offensive on St. Lo would have started sooner, but for a shortage of ammunition, especially artillery ammunition, which was being used up rapidly in supporting attacks. By now, 850,819 Allied soldiers had come ashore, 452,469 of them American, and the strain on the supply services was growing. On June 22nd, there had only been 1 day's supply of 25-pounder artillery ammunition, and 4.2-inch mortar ammunition in the British dumps, and rationing had to be imposed. Such was the effect of the great storm, but hard work by the supply teams soon eased that particular crisis. By July 1st, the British had 9 days' supply of artillery ammunition at normal usage, and 15 days' supply of mortar ammunition. Some explanation on these points, and the offer of sound reasons for delay by Montgomery, would have quietened the moans of complaint at chafe, and enabled the Normandy battle to be pressed without this continual carping from on high. Nor were lengthy explanations needed. The reason the Allied armies were not making faster progress could be summed up in 4 words: the bocage, supply, the weather, and the enemy. As June ended, US 5th Corps were still stuck in the bocage, 5 miles northeast of St. Lo, while on the Second Army front, the 30th and 8th Corps were licking their wounds after Epsom, but both armies were preparing to attack again. According to General Montgomery's instructions of June 30th, while the Second Army were to continue to hold the main enemy forces between Caen and Villers-Bocage, and develop operations for the capture of Caen as opportunity offers, and the sooner the better, US First Army was to begin on the right flank an offensive southwards on July 3rd, and then, pivoting on its left at Caumont, swing eastwards to a general line, Caumont-Vir-Mortain-Fougères. Montgomery's instruction of June 30th should be borne in mind when claims surface later about the origins of the Cobra breakout. To keep up the pressure at Caen, The Canadians were to thrust again for Carpiquet on July 4th, and the British were to attack Caen on July 8th, just after the attack of US 8th Corps down the west coast of the Cotentin came to an end. Pressure was being applied at either end of the Allied line constantly to stretch and reduce the German resources. That said, there was a need to press on, especially on the western flank, where the breakout would eventually take place. US 5th Corps were stalled in front of Saint-Lô, and their advance south from Caumont had come to a halt against the bastion of 2nd Panzer. In the Cotentin, US 8th Corps had started their push on the west coast, while on the east the British and Canadians were still battering fruitlessly and expensively at the defences of Caen, where the German position had stabilised after Epsom. However, as Bradley pointed out, if the Second Army kept the German panzer divisions busy defending Caen, that was as good as possessing it. Even so, with much promised and less delivered in the early weeks of the campaign, the commanders at Schaeff had some reason to be querulous. Anxiety was also present on the German side. The British official history comments, "While the fighting was being conducted with skill by the local German commanders and with stubborn bravery by their troops, the battle as a whole was being conducted by Hitler. Not even a division could be moved without his concurrence." This seems to be quite true, and when the command situations of the two sides are compared, it can be argued that the Allied High Command had rather less to worry about than the situation appears to present, although General Eisenhower may have sometimes envied Hitler's wide-ranging powers over his subordinate commanders. On July 3rd, Hitler sacked Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander at OB West, allegedly because of his handling of the Epsom offensive, but more probably because the Führer and von Rundstedt had a fundamental disagreement on how the Normandy battle should be handled. Out too, on July 4th, went Gerd von Schweppenburg, command of Panzer Group West passing to General Eberbach, but at this point, to put the German end-of-June situation in perspective, we must go back a little. Since the invasion, von Rundstedt had been appealing to OKW for permission to order extensive adjustments to the front of 7th Army and Freedom, should the need arise, to withdraw the German forces from around the Allied beachhead to a more favourable defensive line somewhere inland, beyond the range of naval gunfire. The answer to this request was a firm and constant no, but von Rundstedt, backed by Rommel, continued to press this point and irritate the Führer. Von Rundstedt had also been urging a strong armoured counterattack to split the British-American line at Caumont, a very sound tactical scheme. This proposal attracted the Führer's approval, and plans to implement it were in hand when Hitler suggested that an attack should also be mounted against the rear of the American forces moving on Cherbourg. This too was a worthwhile initiative, but on June 26th, von Rundstedt pointed out that he lacked the force to do both, at least with any possibility of success, and insisted that the Caumont attack must have priority, which is probably correct. Two newly arrived divisions, 9th SS and 10th SS Panzer, were to spearhead this attack, but as we have seen, the British then launched the Epsom offensive across the Odon, and these two divisions were soon sucked in to resist it. Arguing with Hitler was fruitless, but on June 28th to 29th, von Rundstedt and Rommel motored 700 miles to the Führer's retreat at Berchtesgaden, where Hitler and his senior advisers, Keitel and Jodl, held a conference with the two field commanders. No meeting of minds appears to have taken place. When the field marshals left for Normandy, they were followed by another Führer directive, insisting that they hold every metre of ground as before. The last development came 3 days later on July 3rd, when, in the course of a telephone conversation on the Normandy difficulties, Keitel asked von Rundstedt what could be done. "Make peace, you fools," von Rundstedt replied. "What else can you do?" Keitel rushed to pass this titbit onto the Führer, and on July 7th, von Rundstedt was sacked. His replacement was Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, a devoted supporter of the Führer, or so it was generally believed. Von Kluge served as an artillery officer in the First World War, but he also learned to fly, an activity which gave him an early grasp of the importance of air power. He remained in the army after 1918, rising steadily in rank and reputation, and when Hitler came to power in 1933, von Kluge was a major general. He was then prompted Lieutenant General and in 1936 given command of the 6th Corps. This rapid promotion did not endear Hitler to von Kluge, who participated in a plot to overthrow the Führer in 1938, a plot that came to nothing when the Munich crisis gave Hitler all he wanted. Hitler's anti-Semitic policies were anathema to von Kluge, but he could not deny the success of the Führer's strategy, or fail to approve the expansion of the German army, and his attitude towards Hitler from 1939 on has rightly been described as ambivalent. Commanding the Fourth Army, he took part in the Polish campaign in 1939 and the invasion of France in 1940, after which he was promoted to Field Marshal. He then took part in the Russian campaign and stayed in the East until 1944. Now he was given the command in the West and was expected to do what the Führer wanted, hold every metre of ground and then drive the invaders into the sea. Von Kluge was not a fool. He had seen the gradual collapse of German power in Russia, seen the destruction of Germany from the air, and knew that whatever was done in the field, East or West Germany was eventually doomed, and that by the summer of 1944, Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. Like a number of officers who had served on the Eastern Front, he was also convinced that the war in the West was a softer option, waged against a less aggressive foe. Shortly after arriving in Normandy, he had reason to change his mind on that point.